Yul Brynner stepped through the smoke-filled corridors of the Sands Hotel and immediately sensed the kind of danger that had nothing to do with stage lights or camera angles. Knowing that somewhere in these labyrinthine backstage passages, Jerry Lewis was about to discover that some debts in Las Vegas were paid with blood instead of money. October 1962, 11:30 at night in the neon-soaked heart of Sin City, and the 36-year-old comedy king was trapped in a nightmare that would either end with his death or reveal whether Hollywood's most imposing dramatic star possessed the courage to face real violence instead of scripted gunfights. If you're fascinated by untold stories of Yul Brynner's most dangerous real-life encounters, subscribe to Yul Brynner Untold Legacy for more hidden moments where genuine heroism met deadly circumstances in the shadows of fame. The Sands Hotel backstage area reeked of cigarette smoke, stale alcohol, and the particular tension that came from mixing entertainment with organized crime in a city where both were equally profitable and equally dangerous. Dimly lit corridors stretched like arteries through the building's core, connecting dressing rooms, storage areas, and the kind of private spaces where business was conducted away from the prying eyes of tourists and federal agents. Jerry Lewis sat alone in his dressing room, still wearing the tuxedo from his late show, his hands trembling as he tried to light a cigarette with fingers that refused to remain steady. The performance had been flawless. 90 minutes of brilliant physical comedy that had left 3,000 tourists screaming with laughter. But the moment he stepped off stage, reality crashed down on him like a collapsing building. The debt was real. The threats were real. And Anthony "Big Tony" Marcello, who represented the Chicago outfit's interests in Las Vegas, was not the kind of man who accepted excuses or extended payment schedules. Lewis had gotten involved through what seemed like innocent circumstances: a poker game in a private suite, friendly stakes among entertainment industry colleagues, nothing more serious than the kind of after-hours socializing that made Vegas different from any other city in America. But what started as entertainment had evolved into something more serious when Lewis's famous competitive streak combined with a run of spectacularly bad luck. $50,000. More money than most Americans made in 5 years, but still manageable for someone of Lewis's earning power. The problem wasn't the amount. It was who held the markers and what they expected in return for their patience. Big Tony wanted more than money. He wanted favors. Specifically, he wanted Lewis to use his connections and influence to facilitate certain business arrangements that would be highly illegal and extremely dangerous for everyone involved. The kind of favors that turned entertainment figures into criminal accomplices and made them permanent assets of organized crime families. Lewis had refused, hoping that his celebrity status would provide some protection, that even the mob wouldn't risk the publicity nightmare of harming America's most beloved comedian. But Big Tony had made it clear that celebrity meant nothing in the private spaces where debts were settled and examples were made. That's when the dressing room door opened without a knock. Big Tony entered first, his massive frame filling the doorway like a human eclipse. At 52, he carried himself with the absolute confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through the careful application of violence. His expensive suit couldn't disguise the fundamental brutality of his nature, and his cold gray eyes suggested that he had long ago stopped viewing other human beings as anything more than obstacles or opportunities. Behind him came 2 lieutenants, muscle-dressed in the kind of tailored clothing that made their lethal profession look almost respectable. Vincent "Vinny" Romano and Salvatore "Sal" Benedetto, men whose faces revealed nothing but whose reputations spoke volumes about their willingness to follow orders regardless of their moral implications. "Jerry," Big Tony said conversationally, settling into a chair without being invited while his associates positioned themselves to block any possible escape route. "We need to talk." Lewis's cigarette trembled between his fingers as he tried to maintain the facade of calm professionalism that had served him throughout his entertainment career. "Tony, I thought we had an understanding. I just need a little more time to arrange the financing." "Time," Big Tony repeated thoughtfully, as if the concept required careful consideration. "Funny thing about time, Jerry. It keeps moving whether we want it to or not." And right now, your time is running out faster than you probably realize. He gestured toward Vinny, who produced a manila envelope from his jacket and set it on the dressing room table with deliberate ceremony. You know what's in there? Louis shook his head, though something in his expression suggested he had a terrible suspicion about the envelope's contents. Photographs, Big Tony explained with the patient tone of someone educating a child. Very interesting photographs of you entering and leaving certain establishments, having conversations with certain people, accepting certain payments for certain services. The implication hit Louis like a physical blow. Even if the photographs were fabricated or taken out of context, their existence alone would be enough to destroy his career and possibly land him in federal prison. The mob had been building a case against him, creating leverage that went far beyond simple gambling debts. "I never accepted any payments," Louis whispered, his famous voice reduced to barely audible panic. "I never provided any services. You know that." "What I know," Big Tony replied with a slight smile that carried no warmth whatsoever, "is that these photographs tell a very convincing story. And stories like this have a way of finding their way to the wrong people. Federal agents, newspaper reporters, studio executives who might not understand the complexities of your situation." Sal stepped forward, cracking his knuckles with the kind of casual precision that suggested considerable experience with physical persuasion. "Or maybe Jerry just disappears tonight. Tragic accident, mugging gone wrong. This is Vegas after all. Dangerous city for tourists who wander into the wrong neighborhoods." The threats were no longer subtle. Louis understood that he was facing a choice between cooperation and elimination, between becoming a permanent criminal asset or becoming a cautionary example for other entertainers who might be tempted to resist mob pressure. "What do you want?" Louis asked, his voice barely audible. "Smart question," Big Tony approved. "We want you to use your connections at the studios. We want inside information on certain financial arrangements. We want you to help us launder money through your production companies. Small favors, really. Nothing that would seriously compromise your artistic integrity." The sarcasm in his voice made it clear that he viewed artistic integrity as a luxury that Louis could no longer afford. "And if I refuse?" "You won't refuse," Big Tony said with absolute certainty, "because you're too smart to choose death over cooperation. Because you understand that family obligations sometimes require sacrifices that individual preferences don't allow." That's when the dressing room door opened again, without warning or permission. Yul Brynner stepped into the cramped space like a force of nature entering a confined environment, his black formal wear making him appear to absorb the dim lighting while his presence somehow expanded to fill every corner of the room. His entrance was so quiet and controlled that for a moment the mobsters didn't realize that the balance of power in the room had just shifted fundamentally. At 42, fresh from his triumph in the Magnificent Seven, Yul carried himself with the kind of absolute authority that came from playing characters who never backed down from any challenge, no matter how overwhelming the odds. His dark eyes swept the room, taking in the tableau of intimidation with the calm assessment of someone who had faced down worse threats than 3 well-dressed criminals in an expensive hotel. "Gentlemen," Yul said quietly, his accented voice cutting through the cigarette smoke and tension with surgical precision. "I believe you're in the wrong room." Big Tony turned slowly, his expression shifting from confident control to careful evaluation, as he recognized one of Hollywood's most formidable dramatic stars. "Mr. Brynner, we weren't expecting company." "I'm sure you weren't," Yul replied, stepping further into the room with the measured pace that had made Chris Adams such a compelling character. "But here I am, and now you gentlemen are going to leave." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge that everyone present understood was far more serious than casual conversation. Vinny and Sal shifted their positions slightly, their hands moving closer to the weapons they undoubtedly carried, but something in Yul's bearing suggested that violence might not provide the advantage they usually enjoyed. "This is a private business meeting," Big Tony said carefully, clearly uncertain about how to handle an intervention he hadn't anticipated. Nothing that concerns you, Mr. Brynner. Jerry Lewis concerns me, Yul replied immediately. He's a colleague, a professional, someone who deserves better than being threatened by parasites who mistake intimidation for strength. The insult was delivered with such casual authority that it took Big Tony a moment to process what he had just heard. When the words registered, his face darkened with the kind of rage that usually preceded extreme violence. "You don't know what you're walking into here," Big Tony warned, rising from his chair with movements that emphasized his considerable physical presence. "This is business. Real business. Not movie business." "I understand business perfectly," Yul said, his voice dropping to the quiet tone that those who knew him recognized as genuinely dangerous. "I understand that you're trying to transform an entertainer into a criminal. I understand that you're using fear to accomplish what you can't achieve through legitimate means. And I understand that you're about to leave this room and never return." Vinny took a step forward, his hand moving toward his jacket with obvious intent. "Maybe you didn't hear Tony. This ain't your concern." That's when Yul demonstrated why his screen presence translated into real-world authority. Without any visible rush or dramatic gesture, he moved closer to Vinny, with the kind of controlled precision that suggested complete confidence in his ability to handle whatever violence might follow. His approach was so calm and purposeful that it seemed to bypass normal intimidation patterns and enter territory that even experienced criminals found unsettling. "You have two choices," Yul said, speaking directly to Big Tony while maintaining perfect awareness of Vinny's position and Sal's nervous shifting. "You can leave now, quietly and permanently, abandoning whatever schemes you've constructed around Mr. Lewis. Or you can discover whether I learned anything useful during my years playing men who face impossible odds without backing down." The silence that followed was electric, with potential violence and uncertain outcomes. Big Tony studied Yul's face, looking for signs of bluff or weakness, but finding only the kind of absolute commitment that made retreat seem like wisdom rather than cowardice. "You threatening us?" Sal asked, his voice carrying less confidence than his words suggested. "I'm explaining reality," Yul replied without shifting his attention from Big Tony. "Mr. Lewis is under my protection. Any future contact with him will be considered a personal insult that requires personal response. Any harm that comes to him will be traced back to you, and the consequences will be permanent." Big Tony understood that he was facing something he had rarely encountered in his criminal career. Someone whose reputation for controlled violence was based on more than mere reputation. Someone who possessed both the capability and will to follow through on threats that most people made only in desperation. "This isn't over," Big Tony said finally, gesturing for his lieutenants to follow him toward the door. "Yes," Yul replied with absolute certainty, "it is." After the mobsters left, Lewis sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing what had just occurred and gradually understanding that his life had just been saved by a man whose courage extended far beyond scripted heroics. "Why?" Lewis asked finally. "Why risk yourself for me?" Yul studied him with the same calm assessment he had used to evaluate the criminal threat. "Because courage is either real or it isn't. Because some things matter more than personal safety. And because men like Big Tony only understand one language, and someone had to speak it fluently enough to end the conversation." Years later, Jerry Lewis would describe that night as the moment he understood the difference between performing courage and possessing it, between playing heroes and being one. "Yul didn't just save my life that night. He showed me what real strength looks like when it's not enhanced by editing or protected by studio security." The incident was never reported to police or mentioned in entertainment industry publications, but it marked the end of organized crime attempts to compromise Lewis through intimidation. Word spread through Vegas criminal networks that the comedian was under the protection of someone who couldn't be threatened, bought, or intimidated into cooperation. Yul Brynner never spoke publicly about the encounter, maintaining the privacy that had always characterized his approach to personal relationships. But those close to him noted that his friendship with Jerry Lewis deepened considerably after 1962, based on mutual respect and shared understanding of what authentic courage required when facing genuine danger.